finding the time and the peace to be able to recover that within ourselves, and I've seen that happen. And so, I think despite the terrible things that have happened to us, we can recover, and but not by the means given to us, but by the ways that we find for ourselves, if you know what I mean.
Within ourselves?
Within ourselves, and the lessons that are passed on. All of this is like an incredible learning for me about, well, I'm able to look at my own culture for what it really is now, right? Not the nice version I was given from young, but really, this dark side of our culture and Christianity, at least the way it worked out in Canada. And I got to take, what the Germans had to do after World War II. We've got to own up. We've got to take responsibility. But I don't see that happening in a big way yet, and I think it'll come eventually, but it needs a lot more pushing, a lot more exposure of this truth.
Well, let's talk about what led up to the apology and how that came about, and what's on the forefront that needs to be done.
Well, it's kind of like from the beginning. The government and the churches, they weren't talking about apologies until the lawsuits began about 10 years ago. The first group of residential school survivors began suing the government and the churches. And then you began to hear talk about, how we're sorry about some aspects of this, the physical and the sexual abuse they've apologized for. But what was significant was last year when we released our film, there was a native member of Parliament who got up in Parliament in Ottawa. He had seen our film, Unrepentant, and so he got up in Parliament and asked a question to the government. He said, when are we going to start repatriating the remains of these children who died? They need to be brought home for proper burial. At that point, the lid came off. The government began to talk about the graves. They announced this bogus Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The media began reporting it, and so that's really the thing in the most recent times has caused a lot of this. It's basically been the survivors coming forward and putting pressure on the government and the churches. They've had their backs to the wall because of this. And, it shows you the power of truth. I mean, one or two people talking about what really happened has an incredible ripple effect. And people began to finally acknowledge, well, okay, what Kevin's been saying all these years is true. I mean, it's not just out of his disgruntled mind. I mean, that's the way the church was portraying me, like I just had an axe to grind. And then when stuff I was showing over the years is now being validated by eyewitnesses, the government and the churches had to respond. So they responded by thinking that an apology and a bit of money is going to be enough, and now we can kind of move on. But the trouble is that when you take the lid off something, more and more comes out, and it becomes even harder for them to contain it. And, an example of that, up on our website, hiddenfromhistory.org, there's an interview, a little video clip from a woman called Irene Favel, who was at a Catholic residential school when she was a little girl. She's a Cree woman. She lives in Saskatchewan. And she said when she was a little girl, she witnessed a baby who had been born, like a young girl had been raped by a priest. And when this baby was born, she saw the priest take this little baby who was still alive and throw it in the furnace, and it was burned up.
Oh, my Lord.
And she said they were all standing there. They heard the little cry. It's so disgusting. I mean, to hear this, and yet it's like there's been no outcry in Canada about this. It's been out there for almost a year. There's been no editorials about this. No, it's only the work we're doing that's bringing this out. And that's what I mean about Canada. It's a culture of a real silence. It's like, you really feel isolated very quickly when you start getting into this stuff. And so, frankly, it's only by going outside Canada, by going to the U.S., and folks like you, getting the word out kind of through the underground, if you like, that this has been coming out more and more, and nevertheless creating a lot of pressure on the people who did it.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, we have people that don't believe these residential schools or the sterilizations in the United States happened either.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I believe it.
But then I guess they would rather keep their blindfolds on than to face that our government was able to do something like that. And it just how can anyone believe in a higher power or a creator after seeing something like that or being treated like that? And they expected these children to grow up with an allegiance to God?
Well, I think, I don't expect people to believe in the church as a religion, but that's not the same thing. I think people should realize that it's only by finding that higher power in ourselves, that we can survive a lot of these things, you know. But that higher power doesn't have anything to do with organized religion. I think it's frankly the enemy of religion, in that it's saying to people, you know, we find our way to the truth ourselves, and you can't go around killing people and taking their land in the name of God. I mean, that has nothing to do with the Jesus I ever read about in the Bible. And so the thing to understand is, I think we're dealing with an empire, you know. The church has latched onto this empire to think that that's the way they were going to, you know, prosper in the world. And as a result, they had to kind of deny their own teachings, deny their own spirit that Jesus was talking about compassion and justice. So I, you know, in a way, I think it's by, I never thought, you know, in my own life, I thought I understood what I was about, but I didn't until I had to go through a lot of the suffering to have my eyes opened up, right? And that has been something I would never, ever want to, you know, let go of. I think in that sense it was worth it, and I think that's one of the things that we can learn through this kind of loss.
Well, I don't know, you know, about the residential school.
Yeah.
Have they been able to find a peace with the Creator, I guess is what I'm asking about.
I don't know, you know, it's hard to generalize, and I wouldn't want to speak for other people. I know I've seen examples of people who've come through this, like William and others, but those are actually, from my experience, are the exception, not the rule. Most of the people who've gone through these schools are totally crushed. They're not able to talk about it. A lot of them end up taking their own life or dying at a really young age. The vast majority of people are not going to get justice out of this. This is the bitter kind of reality, is that most people are crushed and broken by this. But for me, that's all the more reason to talk about it, to say, okay, it's for those people that we're doing this, and for the children who never came back. I mean, nobody speaks for them. You know, what about all those innocent children who died? Are we going to just pretend that it never happened? I mean, it demeans ourselves if we don't take responsibility for that, right?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when the Prime Minister made the apology,
yeah.
What has transpired from that point forward?
Well, the apology was really limited. It basically said, you know, we're sorry for the residential schools. He didn't go so far as to say they were a wrong thing to do. He just said, you know, we're sorry for the impact on your life. And he made vague reference to children not coming back, but they didn't give any steps about what they were going to do about it. Because at the same time, he said in the same speech that it was a government responsibility, which was a total lie. These schools were set up by the churches. They were maintained by the churches. The government often wanted to close residential schools, but it was the churches that kept them open. And yet the churches are totally off the hook. They're not being held liable legally for any of these crimes, including the deaths of children. They're not even, they don't even have to identify where these graves are, which you'd think would be the first thing they'd have to do.
Yes.
And yet they're totally off. So apology is fine at a word level, but it hasn't really played out in action. Over half the